Hello, everyone. Happy Monday, and welcome to another edition of the X's and O's with Greg Cosell and Doug Farrar. That's Greg Cosell over there, senior producer of NFL Films and ESPN's NFL Matchup. I'm Doug Farrar, editor at the USA Today Sports Media Group. And Greg, we're going to do the X's and O's a little early today because tomorrow's July 4th. And I'd like to continue our series where we're kind of building the perfect positional units. We started with the secondary. We did the defensive line last week. This week, I'd like to get into the offensive line. And I'd like to start with, and you're at NFL Films in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. I know you're very familiar with the Eagles. It's, I would say, a common consensus that the Eagles had the best offensive line in the NFL last year. And the thing I found interesting about them is schematically, I mean, they weren't really a this or that team. It wasn't like, oh, we're zone, they kind of did everything. And where I'm leading here is Jeff Stoutland, their offensive line coach, is commonly recognized as one of the best, if not the best, at what he does in the NFL. I mean, this sounds rhetorical, but it really isn't, because I've seen this go both ways. How important is it to have a great offensive line coach for that line to work? And what is the difference between a guy like Stoutland and a guy who's just sort of average?
Well, you know, those are hard. Those are not easy questions. You might think they are.
Right.
They're not really easy.
I mean, it's not. Well, I mean, I say it sounds rhetorical. Obviously, you'd want a great offensive line coach like a Scarnecchia or a Bill Callahan or Alex Gibbs or whoever.
I mean, there's a lot of good ones, obviously. Yeah. You know, offensive line to me has always been one of those positions, and obviously there's two tackles, two guards, and a center, but just offensive line as a whole has always been something that I felt like I really needed to keep studying and studying, because those guys and the coaches, they kind of live in a world of their own. And you know, they're different cats, as it were. Yes. And I've been fortunate throughout my career to be at training camps and close to watching offensive line coaches work with individual offensive linemen. And just like everything, the way it's coached, everything is so precise. You know, you could see an offensive line coach and you could see an offensive lineman step with his foot, and an offensive line coach will step in and say, no, you went 6 inches too far. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it's really for something that on TV looks like just a bunch of big guys battling a bunch of other big guys. It's really very precise with your foot movements, your hand placements, how they have to work together. I remember years and years ago when I had not been doing matchup for very long, and of course, Alex Gibbs, that's who I'm thinking of. Alex Gibbs and that running game with Denver and Mike Shanahan. Yep. And I remember just going back and forth with my Cowboy remote, watching that run game and the way all 5 offensive linemen moved totally in unison in their zone run game. I mean, you could go back and forth and all the movements were exactly the same. The foot movements, the hand movements. I mean, it looked, for want of a better way of describing it now, you know, it looked like synchronized swimming. You know, it just looked like everybody was doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. And you know, that element of offensive line play goes beyond teaching individuals, because there's 5 guys that have to work together. And I remember having a great conversation a number of years ago with Phil Simms. And Phil said to me, you know, most people assume that the pass game is much harder to teach than the run game. And he said the run game is actually so much harder to teach and master, just because of the way you have to teach it with so many guys having to do and react to exactly the same thing.
Sure.
And, you know, so your question, it's probably not a great answer that I just gave, but, you know, I mean, in a sense, what makes a great O-line coach? I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. You know, details, as in really in everything in football, are so critical. I think working together is critical. I think you need to understand what you're playing against, you know, defensive fronts. People don't think about that because you block different defensive fronts differently. So if you have a certain play call, you know, people might think, oh, it's an outside zone run, or let's say, you know, it's inside zone, or whatever it is. You know, if it's a certain front, defensive front, you block it a certain way. If it's a different front, you block it a different way. Yeah. You know, all these things come into play. You know, there's a lot going on with the offensive line that it really requires guys to be football smart and have what is often referred to as athletic intelligence.
Yes.
I guess a different kind of AI, but it's athletic intelligence. You really need to be able to understand how different things, both before the snap and after the snap, affect how you go about doing what you do.
I've been in a lot of locker rooms, and I've found generally, if I really want to know what's going on, if I've developed a relationship or even a casual, conversation with an offensive lineman, that's where I go. Because generally speaking, offensive linemen are going to be among the smartest players on the team. That really is kind of a non-negotiable.
Well, and it's funny you say that because, a lot of times, you'll watch tape and you'll see, depending on how detailed we get to watch tape, we're trying to get through a lot of things, you and I, but sometimes you'll notice, oh, well, they like to run that against an over front. Well, no, and they like to run something else against an under front. And, these are all things offensive linemen have to understand these things just intuitively. It's not like it's not like you're taking a test and you have a chance to, to put down your number 2 pencil and think about it for a few minutes. These things just have to happen. And, your point is really correct. These guys are really smart. They're really aware. Now their worldview is certainly different. They're not necessarily worried about safeties, who are 10 or 12 or 15 yards off the ball. That's not kind of their worldview. Certainly not if they're in a 3-point stance. If in the running game I'm talking about. Now, pass protection is a whole nother that's a whole nother thing, because now with the increase in the details and nuances and subtleties of pressure schemes, they've got to be aware of so many things, of where guys are lined up. Hey, is that linebacker, is he 2 feet, to one side where he's normally not there? What does that tell me? Hey, is that slot corner, a tackle has to say, is that slot corner, is he just a little closer than he normally is? Because that may be an indicator for a blitz. These are all things you have to be aware of and just know like that. Like I said, it's not as if you have a minute or 2 minutes to go, let me check all this out and see how it goes.
Let me look at my metrics on my phone. No, you don't have time.
No, you have to see it and know it. And, you see all these pressure schemes now because defensive coaches are pretty smart too. And offensive linemen have to pick all this stuff up, even something that seems simple like stunts. Okay. Looping stunts by defensive linemen. Offensive linemen have to understand exactly when they give up their guy because he's looping and respond to someone else. I mean, how many times do we see when that doesn't work the way it's supposed to work?
We discussed the 49ers overload blitzes last week, and you're watching those, and everyone's like, okay, I got my guy, but oh wait, and I was doing some tape work on Micah Parsons this morning for an article I'm doing, and he had 1 sack against Gardner Minshew, 1 sack, pressures, not sacks, excuse me, but he was at linebacker depth, and he was kind of hiding behind the nose tackle, sort of waving around like, okay, when he goes, I'm just going to shoot the gap. And the center's like, oh, okay, now I got the nose tackle and Micah Parsons. What the hell am I supposed to do? So I think defensive lines and defensive pressure schemes present so much more of a challenge for offensive linemen now than they ever have before.
I would agree with that 100%. And it's really, really difficult. I mean, how many teams now line up, and again, it's usually in sub fronts, but with a 6-man front or, and then there's maybe a safety who's kind of walking up but not walking up. You have to figure out, how to, because you have to account for people, even if they're not all coming, you still have to account for them. You can't assume, oh, I don't think he's going to come. You don't know that. I mean, to some degree, certain things based on your film study, but you still have to account for people. So you have to have a way to do that and a way to communicate that, when you get to the line of scrimmage. You can have a play call with a certain protection called, and then all of a sudden you get to the line of scrimmage and you see a front or a look that protection may not be able to handle. And whether it's the quarterback or the center, very often it's the center, he might have to change that protection call with, 13 seconds left on the play clock, and everybody's got to get it. And that's not easy.
Well, we are sort of assembling our perfect offensive line here, and when we start with tackles, And we discussed this, I think, on our first podcast. The ostensible difference between right and left tackles, like the left tackle is the talented guy and the right tackle is sort of the schlub. And we agreed that's gone. I mean,
yeah, the only difference is the left tackle is responsible for the blind side. So if you view that as a big difference, then that's the difference. But in terms of the quality of pass rusher they face in today's NFL, that's no longer that relevant. There are phenomenal pass rushers who work from the left side of the defensive front against the right tackle.
Yep. And then we also have talked about the advent of quick game and RPOs and things like that. So tackles have to, get in their sets quickly. But you've mentioned the importance of the vertical set. So when we're talking about ideal tackles, let's get back into that and discuss why vertical sets are so important.
I think if you talk about tackles, and this is general, there's a lot within this, but there's probably be considered three kinds of sets: a short set, a 45-degree angle set, and a vertical set. Normally, let's say if it's third and long, you're in a vertical set, and that's why a lot of coaches believe that third down is the critical piece to being able to play tackle, because if you can't pass protect on third down and the offense is required to help you, that really limits what you can do in the pass game. So for an offensive tackle, third down is critical because, as we've discussed, they control the width of the pocket. They need to keep people outside, away from the quarterback from a width perspective, okay? And you want them to be able to do that one-on-one. So what do they have to be able to handle? They have to be able to handle what we would call speed to power. They have to be able to handle that. They have to be able to handle high side speed. In other words, their outside shoulder. They can't allow pass rushers to beat them off their outside shoulder. That's high side speed. The other thing then, which is the corollary to that, is they have to be able to handle low side or inside quickness. They have to be able to handle those three things at their core.
They have to handle high side speed and then low side speed for the inside counter. Like you take that jab step outside,
right?
Inside you come.
Right. So if you can't handle those things individually, then it's really hard to be a good pass protecting tackle in this league, because then you require help. And that's a problem. So if you're a tackle in pass pro, particularly in vertical sets, you need to be able to handle that. Now, obviously, so much more goes into the nuance and detail of doing that with your foot movements and your hands, and being able to reset your hands is really important, because very often when you start in pass protection, you might have your hands in a certain position, and different O-line coaches teach that differently. Some O-line coaches want your hands ready up here. Some O-line coaches, like Jeff Stoutland, for instance, he wants you. He has the offensive linemen, the tackles, have their hands lower to start. And
just to break in, is that kind of a thing where some receivers don't reveal their hands until the last second?
I don't know if that correlates exactly, but it's just, again, I'm not sure the reason why different line coaches take that approach. But the point I was making is, a lot of times your first strike, you do that, and the defensive, the pass rusher could knock it away or do so, and then you've got to reset. You've got to be able to reset your hands in coordination while your feet are moving. Because one thing you do not want to do on a vertical set is just turn your body right to the sideline.
Oh no,
you do not want to do that,
because you're just opening the barn door to whichever way your back is turned.
Right. So so there's a lot of nuance and detail involved in terms of the use of hands and how that coordinates with your feet and your lower body. But when all's said and done, if you can't protect with the vertical sets, it's really hard to be a tackle in this league and play at a meaningful level.
Yep. You said that tackles control the width of the pocket. Guards control the depth of the pocket.
Guards and centers, yeah.
Yeah, guards and centers. And, the different teams do it different ways. Like the Ravens and the Browns pull their guards a ton. And I love watching the Browns pull.
That's in the run game, yep.
Teller, they're so good at it. They can just pull you to death. But in a
Wyatt Teller, one of the best pulling guards in the league.
Oh boy, I've been on his. I've written a lot about Wyatt Teller in the last couple of years. He's wonderful, and Batonio might be the best guard in football, depending on who you like. But when we talk about guards, and again, we could go for 3 hours on this stuff. But given the constraints of our time, what are the things guards need to be able to do in a more general sense to succeed at a high level?
Well, it's funny. I had to learn a lot about guards through the years, because I got caught up when I started really doing offensive line stuff years and years ago as I was trying to learn, and I'm still learning, in fact. But I got caught up in athleticism. And, athleticism is always nice. But,
sure.
When you watch interior offensive linemen in this league, more often than not, they battle and they compete. And it doesn't mean that they're not taught technique. I don't want people to think I'm not saying that they're not taught technique and it's not important.
No, they're not just a bunch of big guys going, ugh.
Right. Obviously, it's very important. But, on a certain level, at some point, you just have to battle and compete to win. Yeah. But, we talked about the depth of the pocket, that centers and guards control the depth, meaning that they can't get pushed back into the pocket, okay? Because then the quarterback doesn't have any space to step up and throw the football.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does that mean then? That means that they must be able to sink and anchor. They can't get pushed back. They have to be able to hold their ground. That's what we call anchor. So, and normally you can't do that standing straight up, so you have to be able to sink, sink your rear end, so to speak, and anchor. And there, it's really important to be able to constantly reset your hands, because you can't just do one thing. Now, the other thing that becomes really important inside as well, particularly against these quality interior pass rushers in the league, and there's more and more of those guys, is you have to be able to mirror and redirect, because they're going to try to beat you, not always just by shoving you back into the pocket. Big guys might try to shove you back into the pocket, but there's a lot of quick, athletic interior D linemen now, and they try to beat you with quickness. So you have to be able to mirror, move side to side and redirect. So if you go one way and then they go the other way, you've got to redirect. So, it's a really difficult deal. Being an interior O lineman is kind of a tough deal.
It's particularly brutal these days because you could have Dexter Lawrence one week and Aaron Donald the next week and Chris Jones the next week, and here comes Jeffrey Simmons, and oh gosh,
and they're different guys.
Yeah, they're all different guys.
They're all different guys.
I mean, Donald can do everything. Simmons is more of that power guy. Chris Jones will just snatch you, bring you in, and throw you aside like a bouncer in a club. It's just evil. I think one thing that, and I was talking to him in Ndamukong Suh at an event about 10 years ago. And I asked him, who gave him the most trouble among any offensive lineman. He said Josh Sitton of the Packers, who played at very high level for a long time. And I would start to watch Sitton. And one thing, and I'm not saying he got beat. I think this happens no matter how good you are. You're going to get pushed back, like you said. Sitton, to me, had the best ability maybe I've seen among guards to recover from being pushed back. He could sort of resync, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's really important for interior guys. And I think very often, and this is true for all offensive linemen, but maybe more so for tackles, is balance and body control. Because, when you're playing against really high-level edge pass rushers, you're not always going to look perfect. I mean, I remember the guy who always looked perfect to me was Joe Thomas. He never looked like he was ever off balance.
I always said his kick was like the arc of an opening door. It was just
I mean, the guy never. It seemed like he was never ever off balance, but that's very, very rare.
Yeah, he was one of one.
So, which is why he was a first ballot Hall of Famer. Obviously, the guy was just ridiculous. It looked easy, which when guys make it look like that, it just blows me away because it's so hard, and he just made it look like it was easy. But the point I was trying to make is, when you're facing big time pass rushers, okay, you're going to get off balance at times. It's just that's the way it is. Okay, you're dealing with guys who are explosive athletes at 60 pounds, 70 pounds lighter than you are. Okay, and they're great athletes. So you're not always going to look pretty. So balance and body control becomes so important. Which another way of saying that is to say you have to be able to recover, because you're going to kind of lose your technique and get out of phase, as the term we like to use. You're going to get out of phase at times. So how do you recover? There's a lot of guys who can't recover. A great example of that was the rookie for the Giants this year, Evan Neal, who was the 6th pick in the draft. And I noticed this in college, and I should have talked about him more when he came out of Alabama, but he would get to the top of his pass set on vertical sets and he'd lose his balance. Okay. And he couldn't, and he couldn't recover. He'd be off balance and then he'd get beat. And that's something he's going to have to work on for this season, obviously. But, you're going to lose your balance. You're going to get out of phase. And it's how do you recover? Yeah. And that is so critical. And then there's different, then different coaches teach different things. There's a technique called independent arm technique. Some coaches teach that without going into all the weeds. But then some coaches want you to use 2 hands. You know, this is all just different philosophies of how to teach pass protection. And the coaches who believe in one will tell you theirs is better than the other, and the other guys will tell you theirs. But it's just different philosophies of how to coach it.
Yeah, different spice. Speaking of the Giants, getting to centers, and every time I watch Dexter Lawrence in the last 6 months or so, I start feeling sorry for centers, because that's you got Dexter Lawrence at 342 pounds right over your head. That's nasty. So centers, not only, I mean, you're getting the ball off, and now it's more shotgun and pistol, so that's different than it used to be.
But it's still snap to step quickness, because you have to be able to then respond instantly.
And then you got this huge, behemoth right over you who's ready to kill you, probably runs a 4.6 40. Then you have to work in tandem with the guards.
Right.
And by the way, you're calling your protections, and you have to be in perfect sync with the quarterback. I kind of think of Jason Kelce in this era as maybe the ideal center, although some are bigger than Kelce. Kelce has obviously been tremendously athletic. But again, in a general sense, when we get to centers, what do you need to succeed?
Well, I think one of the things that you look at, or I look at, and maybe some would disagree, certainly when I'm watching college tape and watching centers, is how do they handle zero technique defensive tackles, guys who line up right over them.
Dexter Lawrence, for example.
What's that?
Dexter Lawrence, for example. No, thank you.
I mean, if you can't handle that, it's going to be hard to play, because by the way, there's increasing in this league with all these 5-man fronts. There's increasing zero techniques or a little nose shades. It's very similar, and if you can't handle that one-on-one, it's going to be hard to play. So that's one thing that I look for. And again, I don't know all the technique and how that's taught, but that's why snap to step quickness is so important, because if you have a guy right over you and you snap the ball, you have to be so quick to get, after you snap it, to get your hands right back in some kind of position. Because if your hands are not in position, you're just going to be driven right back.
Yep.
And, or even if it's not with power, even if a guy is trying to beat you into a gap, you have to be ready to be able to move, So I always feel that the zero technique, the D tackle who lines up head up on a center, that if you can't handle that as an offensive center, it's really going to be hard to be good.
And we get back to stunts and overload fronts, games and things like that. Obviously, it's not always the case, but in a lot of cases I see with those games, you're trying to get to the quarterback, your path is through the center. And if you're occupying one shoulder with, I watched a Nick Bosa overload loop where he, clipped 3 gaps because he's Nick Bosa. And Eric Armstead had the center. It was when Bosa had 3 sacks against the Dolphins, and one of those sacks he looped around inside.
It was a long stunt. He looped around 2 guys.
Williams, and he's like, "Well, what do I do now?" Because so it's the ability to pick up stunts too, and those games and loops and overloads that is, we talk about more of those in today's NFL. So the ability to defeat them or defend them is also increasingly important.
I mean, those kinds of stunts are really hard, those long stunts, because, Bosa is literally coming from a wide 9 alignment outside an offensive tackle, and then he's looping long, and he's getting into the A gap.
He's clipping 3 or 4 gaps in like 0.2 seconds. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to our initial part of the conversation. That's really hard, so there's so much that they have to be aware of, mentally than react physically. I mean, it's a really, really difficult position, all the offensive line, but I mean, those interior guys, that's hard. That's really, really difficult.
Well, Greg, always great to talk football in general with you, and offensive line specifically, kind of a pet project of mine. I was, growing up in Seattle and watching Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson do it, play Mozart the way it should be played 20 years ago, kind of got my interest in that. So always great to talk about the 5 guys up front. Thank you as always, and we'll be talking more X's and O's next week.
Thanks, Doug.